Hello, this is John Smith, and welcome to the Psalming Effect. And this devotional is being provided for you from Weyburn, Saskatchewan, where I serve as the minister for the Church of Christ here in the city. And today I'll be sharing a meditation from Psalm 118, Psalm 118. Before I read the verses from that psalm, I just want to talk about the image that comes to mind when I read these verses. You know, for years I lived across the street from a gated community when I lived in Red Deer, Alberta for 11 plus years. Directly across the street, if you drove straight out of my driveway, you had to drive right into a gated community on the other side of the street. And those were the gates, big gates. There was a gate that closed off the entrance and another big gate that closed off the exit. And so it was always interesting. When we moved into the neighborhood, it was all a pretty brand new subdivision. We built our house, and in the gated community across the street, there were only about half a dozen units that were in there. In the intervening years, I think there's about 200 units that are in there. I'm not sure the exact number, quite a few. It's a large area in there. And it was always interesting to me to watch as a new, and these were manufactured homes that were brought in there, double wide and fairly upscale. This wasn't your, typical trailer park. They would bring these manufactured homes on a huge trailer, and the trailer, of course, would be pulled up right in front of our house, blocking my driveway, of course, and then they would have to open the gates, huge gates. There were going into this gated community, and otherwise it was surrounded by brick wall and high fence all the way around. Except for where these gates were. So these gates would open up, and then there was just enough room. We were on a fairly wide street. It was the main feeder into the subdivision, and this vehicle truck would pull this trailer with this huge, manufactured home around the corner, in a turn into and through the gates into this gated community, and then on into the spot where it would eventually be installed. And the other thing that sticks in my mind when someone talks about opening gates is that I think about how these gates used to automatically close at night. And you'd hear them. We'd be sitting in our living room and we could hear them because they're just directly across the street from us. We could watch through our picture window on our living room as the gates closed. And I don't remember if that was like 9 o'clock or maybe 10 o'clock at night. And then sometime early in the morning they would open. And at any other hour after the gates were closed, one of the residents would drive up and they would have to punch a number into a number pad, and then the gates would open for them and in they'd go. And anyone who was leaving while the gates were closed, there was a sensor that would cause the gates to open for them as they left. And so this would, we got quite used to this. And in fact, my children delivered papers in that gated community, and I took over the paper route from them when they got older and got other jobs, and then the paper delivery, and it was daily paper, started to be early in the morning while it was still dark, and I had to have a passcode to punch into the number pad and open the gates so that I could go in and do papers in there, deliver papers. So that's the image that's very vivid in my mind about opening gates. So there's no mystery then as to why that springs to mind when I read you these verses from Psalm 118, verses 19 and 20. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it. Now there's three things that come to mind, three principles that I think are valuable to us that come from these verses. And you may think of some other things and meditate on some other things that as you read this passage throughout this week. And I would encourage you to do that, and really all of Psalm 118. But here's the three that come to my mind. First of all, God must open the gates of righteousness to us. And he does do that through Jesus Christ. He is our righteousness. We're not able to achieve righteousness by ourselves. Even with our best intentions, we mess up and make mistakes and fall short and really cannot adequately reflect the image of God with our own righteousness. We need God to open up the gates of righteousness that we may enter in. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. But then the second thing is that our desire needs to match that of God's for us to enter those gates and to live in righteousness. Just because we're not going to be able to do it perfectly, just because we're going to fall short and make mistakes, and sometimes we'll fall short because we're actually being rebellious and doing what we know is unrighteous. Sometimes it'll be because we don't know. We inadvertently do what is unrighteous. Or sometimes what happens is, with the best of intentions, we're trying to do the right thing, but we end up saying or doing the wrong thing, and that ends up being unrighteous instead of righteous. And so, but that's not an excuse for us to then not try and to give up and say, well, then it's impossible for me, so I won't bother. It's God's goal for us to enter the gates of righteousness through the path that Jesus Christ opens to us, and then with the Spirit of God that dwells within us, then to live in righteousness as much as possible, to do the right things, to say the right things, to try and go about our business every day, whether it's what we're doing at home, what we're doing at work, what we're doing with our neighbors, what we're doing with our family. If we're going downtown and buying things or selling things, or just going about our tasks, or even our recreation, to do that with integrity, to do it with virtue, to reflect the image of God, to live in righteousness. That's what God calls us to do. And so he opens up the gates that we might enter in and live in righteousness. Now, the other principle that's reflected here as well, when it talks about that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord, is of course the idea that prayer and thanksgiving is the gateway to God's presence. If we want to live in the presence of God, if we want to be present with him, or to think about it from the other end, for him to live with us, the way to open the gate and let him in, or let us into his presence, is through prayer, and especially thanksgiving. That's how we live and how we enter the presence of God, and how we live in the presence of God, through prayer and thanksgiving. So those are three thoughts that come to me from this passage, and I hope they will be a blessing to you to dwell upon today. This being November the 22nd, of 2021, And hopefully throughout this week, you will return to these thoughts and this scripture, maybe this whole chapter, and maybe elsewhere in the scriptures. But the Psalm 118, verses 19 and 20. And remember that in 2021, He is still the one.